Today we're going to talk about risk factors for maltreatment. And now, a long time ago, students talked about this. You know, there are these theories out there, theories about why people maltreat their kids. And I used to cover theories in the class, but really I think those theories are just a bunch of really, are as good as any or bad as any. They don't explain it really well. I don't think we know what the heck, why this happens. I think it's much better just to think in terms of risk factors. That some families are at risk, and here are the kinds of things that make them more risky. And I think if we had some grand theory, if any of you guys come up with a grand theory, I'd love to hear it. Something where you put all this stuff together, because no matter, I mean, the theories that are out there, they're like, yeah, okay, fine, but they should be able to explain a little bit more than they do. So we're not going to talk about theories, we're going to talk about risk factors. Not only that, Monica, who is my former student, hated theories, so she didn't put a theory chapter in her book, even though most child maltreatment books have a theory chapter. She's like, no, not going to do it. My book. So there you go. Okay, so let's talk about risk factors. Now, there's some in your book, and I think that the book does a really nice job talking about risk for maltreatment, and I'll cover some of them, but I'd like to cover some other ones that Monica left out. But let's just, for a moment here, mention some of those that are in the book. Lack of parental preparation. We saw that in that film. I mean, they didn't know what to do. And if you, the other place, how many of you have ever seen that show Super Nanny? Yes, okay? Every single one of those parents, what? I mean, their kids are completely out of control, but they don't know how to parent, right? So Super Nanny comes in, she teaches them how to parent. Lack of preparation. We may often parent the way we were parented, and that may not be good, right? Like the people in the film. Family structure, which I believe you noted, single parenting is a risk factor. We know that all kinds of maltreatment is higher in one-parent versus two-parent households. It's physical abuse, physical neglect is 87% higher, emotional neglect 72% higher, educational neglect, just all of them. Specifically, particularly neglect. Another thing that you see on Super Nanny a lot is large family size and closely spaced together, right? So like you'd see the show and it's like, they have 3 children, 4, 3, and 2 years old. And you're like, oh my gosh, okay? What's wrong with having them so close together? Huh? They don't get enough attention? Yes. They're all going through the same stage of development, and it's like, right, and you're going to be really dang tired, okay? You're just going to be physically exhausted already, and then dealing with things on top of it. So yeah, large family size is going to be a problem. Poor family functioning. Your book mentions this, and particularly communication and interactions between the family members. I would like to present Cora as a very good example from our film last time, where she sits on the couch and says these hideous things to these kids. I'm going to break your head, I'm going to rip your arms off you and beat you, with your arms, and all of these things. It's not really the way a parent should communicate to a child. Okay? And so there's a lot of bad communications there. So those are some of the things that are mentioned in your book. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some other things that aren't covered as well. So, for example, what about psychological disturbance? Some parents have a mental illness, okay? And to what extent does a mental illness interfere with parenting? So, for example, I'm going to show you one example here, specifically schizophrenia. But what we find is, for example, in one study that looked at over 4,000 mothers in Philadelphia, and looked at mothers who had a major mental illness versus those who did not, they found that moms with a serious mental illness were 3 times more likely to be having an active DFS case. Okay, so it suggests that there's some kind of risk here. Now, traditionally, schizophrenia has not really been a consideration for people, okay? Because I'm going to take you way back in the old days. In the 50s, schizophrenia was not treatable. We didn't have all the great drugs. Quite often, people with schizophrenia never got married, never parented, never did anything like that. But fast forward today, people with schizophrenia function really well, medication, and they get married, have kids, and so forth and so on. And the question is, does someone have schizophrenia? What is their parenting like? And I'm going to be honest with you, there are very few studies that have looked at this. But I want to share with you one study. Okay? This was a study in which they had women, 38 women, who were on a psychiatric unit with their infants. Okay? So these people would have their mental illnesses active, okay? Active symptoms. And what they did was they looked at mother-infant interaction for bipolar mothers, mothers with a major depression, and mothers with schizophrenia. And then blind raters rated their interactions on a scale of 1 being the poorest, all the way to 5. So I'm just going to share with you the outcome of this study. Okay? Here's what they measured the moms on. Okay? So remember, lower scores mean poorer functioning. So on virtually every single category, the schizophrenic moms were less than the bipolar or depressed moms. Okay? So their symptoms were interfering with their parenting, much more so than the symptoms of depression and the symptoms of bipolar. Okay? Now this is not abuse. This is just parenting quality. It's not to say that they were abusive, but one of the things that you have here, so they were less warm, less accepting, responsive, sensitive. Why is this a risk then? It does suggest that something's off on your parenting. If something's off on your parenting, what might happen? Your child's going to start acting different, right? And so then you start having child problems. Now what do? Okay? You have less ability to be able to deal with that. So it just points out that this might be a problem. So for example, one of the things that they found was that the schizophrenic moms were just as, so in terms of things like taking care of diapers, understanding, feeding, those kinds of physical things, fine. It was in this part right here. Now, I point this out to you, but I'm going to tell you that we know very little about schizophrenia and maltreatment. Okay? This is one study that suggests that there might be some parenting problems, but there's just nothing out there. Okay? So it has been completely ignored in the literature. However, when I was working I was a parent aide, by the way. That's what I did for a couple of years after graduating from college. I thought I might want to go into clinical psychology. Was a parent aide, decided I didn't want clinical psychology. But one of the things I did work with, I worked with a woman who had schizophrenia. And although at the point that I was working with her, her symptoms were not real florid. I mean, she didn't have active symptoms. She did have a lot of difficulties in parenting. And I noticed it because her symptoms kept interfering with her parenting. So one of the things that was really bothersome to her is sometimes when she got upset, she didn't want you to look at her. Okay? If she got upset, she was stressed, she'd say, "Don't look at me." Okay? And when she meant "don't look at me," she meant turn away from her. Okay? Because if you kept, and what's your normal reaction when you're talking with somebody? You look at them, don't you? So if somebody says, "Don't look at me," you go, "Oh, I'm sorry. Why? Are you upset?" And she's like, "Don't look at me." And I'm like, what do you want me to do? No, she meant, don't look at me. Okay? Turn away. And it was something that upset her very badly. And it sometimes happened with her children. Is that going to be a problem with parenting? Yes. Okay? So I think it's something that we should pay attention to and something that we have completely ignored. On the other hand, we don't have very much data. Oh, the other thing I want to point out here is you see this scale here? this study, there's something missing from this study. And it was nice that they have three different types of mental, people with three different types of mental illness, but what's missing from this study? Yeah, really. So before we go out and say, oh, bipolar moms are just fantastic, you know, we need a control. So that's missing from here. And in fact, studies of things like depression find a very different pattern, right, than what you saw there. And in fact, depression has been the most studied. Oh, and by the way, you know that we're talking mostly about moms. Dads are ignored, pretty much. Okay? No idea what that depression does with fathers. Okay? So depression. We know, and depression that's been studied quite a bit, depressive moms are more neglecting. That doesn't surprise you, does it? Because their depression part of it is a lack of ability to do things. And parenting, you don't have the energy to parent. However, surprisingly, also, we think it's, depressed moms and neglect, but they also are at risk for abuse as well, because they're very hostile also in their interactions with their children. So, depression is a risk factor for children if a parent is depressed. And again, it's all moms that we know about right now. Depressed moms, disorganized household management, often withdraw altogether. So if there's a two-parent family, dad can pick up the slack, right? And I have known families where mom had experienced a postpartum depression and dad picked up the slack. But if it's a single-parent family, there's nobody there to pick up the slack. If mom has withdrawn and is not engaging in the feeding and the caring of the child, and dad can step in, might be okay. And we know that kids who are born to depressed parents also show a variety of problems themselves. So there's a suggestion here that we've got a problem. And there has been lots of work looking at depression, and that's one of the reasons why the pharmacological treatments come into play, okay? Because it's going to interfere with their ability to parent. What about, let me throw another one at you. What do you think of this? Is that a risk factor? Depends on the crime, maybe, right? I mean, because what kind of crimes would you be worried about? Assault crimes and things like that. It's interesting because nobody looks at it. And I find that kind of interesting. One of the few times that I saw that there might be an interest here had to do with mothers who go to prison. And here's the reason why. And by the way, it was the state of Wyoming that was interested in it. And they were going to study it. And I don't know what they ever found. Here's the thing. When men go to prison, the chances that they will reunite with their children after they get out is pretty low. Okay? So they tend to lose their families while they're in prison. Women who go to prison are much more likely to reunite with their children after they get out. And so they are more important to look at because how they treat their kids is going to be really important. Whereas you might say, well, most of these male prisoners are not going to reunite with their family. We don't have to pay attention to them. And so Wyoming was going to study this. They were going to look at women who were in the prison here in the state and look at their parenting after they got out. Whatever happened, I don't know. The only exception in terms of criminality is drug abusers. And you'd expect them to be more what? What kind of maltreatment? Neglect, absolutely. It's huge. And so, because it's so huge, we might as well put a slide up here about substance abuse. Substance abuse is so huge that 80% of the people who are reported to Child Protective Services have a substance abuse problem. That's huge. We're going to talk at some point about child fatalities. And the vast majority of child fatalities are fatalities associated with drug use. Okay? So even things like parents, drunk, passed out, 2-year-old gets out of the house, gets hit by a car. Okay? Substance abuse. You're going to see this over and over and over. And of course, neglect is the main problem associated with neglect. And to show you also again, these are just examples of how big it is. There was this study that asked states what the #1 problem was for them in terms of child maltreatment. And 85% of them, their #1 answer was substance abuse. Just flat out, this is our problem. And as I said, 2/3 of child fatalities are associated with it. So substance abuse is huge. It interferes with parenting. And by the way, we're going to come back to all of these things a lot. This is just throwing a lot of stuff out at you. Let me throw another problem. And when I say problem, is it a problem? What about parents with intellectual disabilities? There's not a whole lot of research on intellectual disabilities. Most of what we know is anecdotal. Anecdotal being, if you talk to a social worker and ask them about this, so most of the work that's done is kind of anecdotal, but almost everyone agrees that parents with intellectual disabilities are going to need a lot of assistance. A lot of assistance. And it's going to have to be more preparation stuff than you would for parents without intellectual disabilities. You might, your parenting might start with things like basic nutrition, where you might not have to start that with other parents. Developmental concepts. Do you potty train a child who's 1 year old? No. Okay? They may not know that. And so if I was a parent with an intellectual disability and I start trying to potty train my 9-month-old, what is going to happen? Yes, you're going to get frustrated because it's not going to happen, and then you might get upset, and then you might strike out. So basic developmental concepts. How to discipline. A lot of parents with intellectual disabilities know one type of discipline. What is it? Spanking. This huge percentage of people with mild intellectual disabilities, it's an environmental intellectual disability, which meant that their house, the place where they grew up, wasn't that great. Right, absolutely. And I worked with one of the families that I worked with in New York. Both of them had intellectual disabilities, and it was an interesting situation. So, for example, just to show you the basics of where we could be at. So they had already had 3 kids taken away. Okay? So when I met them, and she had a baby. She just had a baby, and the baby hadn't been taken away. Okay? So it was Leanne and Lenora, and their baby's name was Lenora. Okay? Just to get you all confused. And so I come one time, and I look at the baby bottle, and the baby bottle has Coca-Cola in it. Okay? And so, Lenora, you can't give a baby Coke. And she goes, well, my mom gave me Coke, and I turned out just fine. I'm like, no, you didn't. You did not turn out just fine. You have an intellectual disability, you have 4 children, 3 of which are in foster care, you're not fine. But that's the level at where we were starting with, was Coca-Cola in a bottle. So, all the crazy things that we dealt with in this family. They needed a lot of support. Okay? Oh, by the way, they were planning, the 2 of them, were planning to have 14 children. Okay? They had 4 when I met them. And a couple of years later when I saw them again, they had a couple more. They're well on their way to 14. Okay? Yes, they're planning to have 14 children. That was their, their plan. So one time I came into the house, all brand new furniture. Okay? They're both on disabilities. Brand new furniture. Where'd you get the furniture? Oh, we're renting it. Like, well, how much does this cost you? Oh, it's only, whatever the guy said, it's only 37 cents a day to rent a couch. And I'm like, well, so 37 cents for the couch, how much was it to rent this? Right. Oh, that's only 12 cents. We added it all up, got my calculator out. I'm like, you don't make that much money, right? Sure enough, they didn't pay, and then the rental company came and took back their stuff. They didn't pay their bills. Electricity got turned off. So what they did was then they opened up, they got the electricity back on by opening an account in one of their kids' names. Okay? Now they don't pay the electricity again. Now that kid's credit is already done. He's 4. So they go to the next kid. Okay? So, I mean, you're talking about the level of kind of what you might have to do. Yeah. And the funny thing about Leon and Nora is that they had a mild intellectual disability, probably around 69, 68, somewhere around there. And so Lenora could read, but Leon couldn't read. Okay? Leon could drive, Lenora couldn't. And they had this old car. And they wanted to come visit me one day, which I was dreading to an inch of my life. So I gave Leon some vague directions on how to get to my house, figuring they're never going to get there. And sure enough, they pulled right into my driveway to visit me. So, yes, okay? Never assume what they can or can't do, okay? He said, your instructions were kind of confusing. I'm like, really? That's what I thought, too. Anyway, most people agree that they're going to need assistance with their children throughout their lives. Because you might be able to get, like Leon and Lenora were not severely disabled, and maybe I worked with them and got through to them that you don't put Coca-Cola in a bottle, and here's how you take care of a baby. But then I go away, and the baby becomes what? A 2-year-old. Do they know how to parent the 2-year-old? No. So somebody needs to be in there to show them how to parent the 2-year-old, and a 3-year-old, and a 14-year-old. They got turned into DFS, and they had their kids taken away. Well, and this is the other thing. This is my craziest couple. Like, they tried to run the DFS worker over with a car once. They were reported 14 times before they got a substantiated case. 14 times. And before I even worked with them, I had seen Leon on television because years before I was a parent aide, he got into trouble for animal abuse, and he was no longer allowed to own a pet. Okay? So he can't own a pet, but they're going to have 14 kids. He can't have a dog because of neglect, and not knowing how to care for dogs. He had a whole bunch of dogs that he didn't care for. Animal Patrol came in, took the dogs out. He can't have a pet, but they're popping out children.
Yeah, but why wouldn't you, why wouldn't you take the kids immediately rather than wait for...
We have to they have to do something wrong, right? So a good example is it's a strange situation. So like a good example was Leon and Lenora had a group of people, I can't believe I'm telling you these stories. But anyway, up above Leon and Lenora in the apartment above was a woman named Esther, okay? Now, Esther had a more severe intellectual disability, and she had already had her daughter taken away from her, okay? So she had had a child, the daughter was gone. The daughter came once in a while for supervised visits, okay? So she couldn't even be alone with her mother, Esther. Well, so Esther hooks up with this guy who also has an intellectual disability, but he's higher functioning, okay? Nice guy, seemed like a nice guy. Of course, she gets pregnant, and now DFS is like, well, what are we going to do? Esther can't take care of a kid, but maybe he can. And so the question is, we'll watch her really carefully, and if something goes wrong, then we'll pull this next kid. And sure enough, she blew it right in the hospital. She never even got out of the hospital because she spanked the newborn, okay? Because it wouldn't stop crying. She spanked the baby, and they were like, done. So. See? But they really didn't have cause until they had something. And so if she has another kid, the same thing. So, again, but they were watching very carefully. So, and she probably never would get those kids back. And by the way, when I worked as a parent aide a million years ago. Now there's been new laws that would keep those kids from being sitting in a foster care. They can only sit there for 2 years and then they have to be adopted out. You know, you can't stay in foster care. Back then, because Esther was still interested in her kids, they probably couldn't have terminated her parental rights, but now they can. Okay. So and her cutest little daughter, and their foster parents wanted to keep her, so maybe they ended up with having her. But yeah, so here's a study, for example, a follow-up study with parents who had an intellectual disabilities. These were 64 parents with MR. I thought I changed it to ID because you know everything changes. Who were reported for abuse or neglect. And what they did was they followed these cases 1 to 7 years later. And here's this right here is the results. After 7 years, a little over 80-some% of those kids, 7 years later, were not in their parents' care. Okay? Only less than 20% of the kids were ever returned to their parents. Okay? So it suggests, and again, we got a problem with this study because what? No control, no comparison. Is this a big number? Is this more than people without an intellectual disability? I don't know. Bad study. However, it does give you an idea that probably when kids go into foster care and their parents have an intellectual disability, it might be a permanent thing. Just to look at the living situation for those kids, here you go. It's a small sample, but here's what happened to them. So you have like almost 35% the parents' rights were terminated. So the children would be put up for adoption. This is the percentage that is with the disabled parent. Percentage of kids who are still in foster care, which should not happen today, but it was happening back then. Kids could languish in foster care and spend 7 years in foster care. It should not happen today. A percentage of parents voluntarily relinquished their kids. A couple had died. One was killed by a mother's boyfriend at 8 months, and another one committed suicide at 11. And then a small percentage with a non-disabled parent. Yeah. So a little over 80% never return to their parents. So this all suggests that intellectual disabilities is a huge risk factor for maltreatment. Parents with intellectual disabilities are going to need a lot of support. And if they have a DFS case, chances are pretty great that they may not be able to get it together enough to get those kids back. This is a big issue. Also not getting a whole lot of attention, but I think it's important. Again, because people with intellectual disabilities do have kids. And so, they're going to need help.